In January 1943, a German officer sat in the basement of a frozen and burning city, writing a letter home he knew would never arrive in time. We do not know his name. The German High Command would later seize the last 7 sacks of mail flown out of Stalingrad, strip the letters of their addresses and signatures, and lock them away. They were too damaging to be delivered. The men who wrote them were already dead or about to be. But the letters survived, and in those letters a generation of German soldiers explained, in their own words, what had happened to them. I am Benito, and welcome to the Jack Historian channel. This is the story of Stalingrad, the battle that consumed 2 armies, destroyed a city that bore one dictator's name, and broke the spine of the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. It is a story about hubris, about suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine, and about the moment the Second World War pivoted on its axis. More than 1 million people died in and around the city between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners, men, women, and children who had the terrible misfortune of being in the path of 2 dictatorships that regarded human life as raw material to be spent. But before we can recount what happened in Stalingrad, we need to understand why anyone was fighting there in the first place. And that means we need to go back, not to 1942, but to the summer of 1941, when Adolf Hitler was absolutely certain he had already won the war. But even before that, to understand how Hitler arrived at that certainty, we have to go back a little further. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. For about 8 months, almost nothing happened on the Western Front. The period people called the Phony War. Then, in May 1940, the Wehrmacht moved. What happened next shocked the world. France, the country that had held the line for 4 years against Imperial Germany in the First World War, collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Army was driven out into the sea at Dunkirk. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium all fell in rapid succession. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled most of continental Europe. He turned to Britain next, but he could not get across the Channel. The Royal Air Force held in the battle in Britain. The invasion was postponed, then quietly shelved. So Hitler turned east. He had always intended to. The war against the Soviet Union was not an opportunistic move. It was the war he had been writing about since the 1920s, in the pages of Mein Kampf. And it had a name, Lebensraum, living space. The argument was straightforward, and it was monstrous. Germany, Hitler said, was overcrowded and resource-poor. To survive as the great power, Germans needed more land, farmland, oil, grain, room to expand. And that land was in the east: Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, the black soil of the steppe. The people already living there were not part of the plan. Hitler considered Slavs racially inferior. The intent was not to govern them. It was to clear them off the land through starvation, deportation, and mass killing, and resettle the territory with German colonists. The cities would be destroyed or reduced to administrative outposts. The survivors would be reduced to a slave labor force serving their new masters. This was not rhetoric, it was the operational planning. The Nazi regime had a document called the Hunger Plan, drafted before the invasion, which calculated that around 30 million people in the occupied Soviet territories would have to starve to death so their food could be redirected to Germany. They knew. It was on the paper. Cities like Leningrad were deliberately besieged rather than captured because feeding the population was not part of the plan. Soviet prisoners of war died in the millions in German camps, not as a byproduct of war, but as a matter of policy. That is the context. The Western Front in 1940 was a war of conquest, brutal but recognizable. What happened in the East was something else. It was a war of extermination, conceived that way from the start. In June 1941, Hitler launched it. 3 million men, the largest invasion force in human history. They crossed the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They called it Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German emperor who symbolized German imperial power. The Red Army was caught half prepared. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the first months. 3 million Soviet soldiers were captured by the end of the year. Most of them did not survive. By December, German troops could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. And they then stopped. That is where our story begins. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to last 6 weeks, maybe 8, certainly no more than 12. The Soviet Union, this rotting structure, you just had to kick in the front door, as Hitler liked to say, and the whole thing would come crashing down. He did not come crashing down. By December 1941, German soldiers were freezing to death in front of Moscow. The Wehrmacht had suffered over 800,000 casualties. The Soviets had lost millions more. Entire armies swallowed whole, and they were still fighting. They had traded space for time, the oldest Russian trick in the book, and now winter had arrived. And with it, a savage Soviet counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. Hitler was furious. He fired generals by the handful. He took personal command of the army, and through the winter and into the spring of 1942, he sat in his headquarters and planned his next move. Here is where you need to understand something critical about Hitler's strategy thinking in 1942. He could not attack everywhere. Those days were over. He no longer had the man or the machines for another Barbarossa-sized offensive across the entire front. He had to choose north, center, or south. He chose south, and there was a logic to it. Not a bad logic, actually. The Southern Soviet Union had two things Germany desperately needed: the oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly around Baku and Maikop, and the grain of the Ukrainian steppe. Without oil, the panzers stop rolling. Without grain, the occupied territories starve. Take the Caucasus oil and you simultaneously fuel your own war machine and strangle the Soviets of theirs. This was Case Blue, Fall Blau, the Great Summer Offensive of 1942. And on paper it was ambitious but not insane. The plan was to drive southeast, secure the Don River crossings, shield the left flank, and then sweep south into the Caucasus. Stalingrad? Stalingrad was an afterthought, a flank objective. The city sat on the Volga River, and whoever held it controlled barge traffic carrying Caucasian oil north into the Soviet interior. The original plan was to neutralize it, get close enough to bring it under artillery fire, and shut down the river traffic. Nobody was talking about capturing it block by block. Remember that, because it will matter. Case Blue launched on June 28, 1942. And in the first weeks, it looked like Barbarossa all over again, the good version. German panzers surged across the steppe, Soviet formation crumbled or retreated. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, owned the sky. It was a kind of sweeping mobile warfare the Wehrmacht did better than anyone. And then something strange happened. The Germans advanced, but they did not capture. The vast encirclements that had swallowed the entire Soviet armies in 1941 were not repeating. The Soviets were retreating, yes, but they were retreating in a way that preserved their forces. They were bending, not breaking. Hitler interpreted this as the enemy's final collapse. His generals saw something more worrying, an enemy that was learning. But then Hitler made the decision that would haunt him. He split Army Group South into two separate entities. Army Group A would drive into the Caucasus, and Army Group B would advance on Stalingrad. Two objectives diverging in opposite direction, and with an ever-widening gap between them. His generals warned him. You cannot support two major offensives simultaneously across a front that was stretching wider with every passing day. The further south Army Group A pushed into the Caucasus, while Army Groups B became more exposed, becoming flanks. And who was guarding those flanks? Not German divisions. There were not enough of those to go around. The flanks would be held by Allied armies. Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, with less equipment, less training and far less stake in the outcome. But in the heat of a summer that still felt like a victory, nobody wanted to hear it. Now let's talk about the other side. Stalin was terrified. The Soviet summer of 1942 was a catastrophe. A botched offensive at Kharkov in May had cost over 200,000 men. The Germans were rolling south and east virtually unopposed. Morale was collapsing. Soldiers were retreating, sometimes without orders, sometimes in outright panic. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order 227. Its nickname tells you everything. Ni shagu nazad. No one steps back. The order was read aloud to every unit in the Red Army. Its message was blunt. Retreat without authorization was treason. Blocking detachments would be stationed behind the lines to shoot anyone who ran. Penal battalions would be formed from officers and soldiers guilty of cowardice and sent into the most dangerous sectors. It is easy to look at Order 227 as pure Stalinist brutality, and it was brutal. But it was also effective. Not because the blocking detachments shot vast numbers of their own men. Recent research suggests they were used more sparingly than Soviet mythology would rather claim. But the psychological effect was real. The message reached every soldier. The time for running is over. You stand or you die. There's no third option. And then the Germans arrived at Stalingrad. Stalingrad stretched for roughly 25 miles along the western bank of the Volga, but it was narrow. In most places only 2 or 3 miles deep. It was an industrial city built in the Soviet style. Massive factories, workers' apartment blocks, broad boulevards designed for military parades, and rail yards that connected the interior to the Caucasus. 3 landmarks would become synonymous with the battle. The tractor factory in the north, which was still producing T-34 tanks. Even as the fighting reached its gates, the Red October steelworks in the center and the Barricadi gun factory between them. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating air raids of the entire war. The 4th Air Fleet flew over 1,000 sorties in a single day. Wave after wave of bombers turned the city into a furnace. The city was not evacuated. Stalin insisted civilians stay, arguing that soldiers fight harder defending a living city than a dead one. He was probably right about that. Still, we cannot understand the psychology behind the brutality. But the cost was monstrous. Estimates vary, but sometimes like 40,000 civilians may have died in the first 2 days of bombing alone. Oil storage tanks along the riverbank were hit and burning fuel poured across the surface of the Volga. Sheets of flaming oil spread across the water, turning the river itself into a wall of fire. Not the water burning, the fuel on top of it, spreading with the current, impossible to escape if you were on a boat or trying to swim. A Soviet officer later recalled looking across the river at the city that night. It looked like the entire earth was on fire. The sky was red. The water was red. I thought this must be what the end of the world looks like. And into this inferno the Soviets poured men. On September 12, General Vasily Chuikov was summoned to the East Bank headquarters of the Stalingrad front and told he was being given command of the 62nd Army, the force defending the city itself. He asked his superior, General Yeremenko, a straightforward question: "What is my task?" The answer was simple: hold the city. Do not let the Germans push you into the Volga. Chuikov looked at Yeremenko and asked a follow-up: "Are there any reserves available?" "Not really, no." Chuikov was 42 years old. He was tough, blunt, and exactly the kind of commander the situation required. Someone who would not panic, would not retreat, and would not flinch at appalling losses. He had a nervous condition that caused the skin of his hands to crack and bleed, a detail that later became symbolic. The general whose hands bled for Stalingrad. He crossed the Volga that night under German fire and set up his command post in a dugout carved into the riverbank bluffs, so close to the German lines that enemy mortars were a daily reality. When staff officers suggested relocating to the safer East Bank, Chuikov refused. If his soldiers could see that the commanding general's headquarters was still on the West Bank, still in the city, still under fire, they would know that no one was leaving. He assessed the situation immediately and made a critical tactical decision that would define the battle. The Germans had two enormous advantages: air superiority and artillery. In open ground, those advantages were decisive. A Soviet unit caught in open terrain would be smashed from the air before he could even engage the German infantry. The solution, Chuikov realized, was to eliminate the distance between the two armies. Get so close to the Germans that their planes and guns would not fire without hitting their own men. He called it hugging the enemy. The tactic was simple to describe and hellish to execute. Soviet soldiers had to get within grenade range, 30 meters, sometimes even less, and stay there. Every building became a fortress, every floor, every room, every stairwell was contested. Soviet units were reorganized into small storm groups, 6 to 8 men, loaded with grenades and an automatic submachine gun called Pepe Shah, trained to fight in enclosed spaces. This was the birth of what the Germans would come to call Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Nothing in the training of the Wehrmacht had prepared it for what happened inside Stalingrad. The German army was designed for movement, sweeping encirclements, rapid penetrations, combined arms maneuvers across open terrain. Everything about German doctrine, German training, German culture of war was oriented towards speed and shock. Stalingrad negated all of it. Inside the city, a panzer was just a large target. Air support was as likely to hit your own positions as the enemy's. Maps became useless within hours because the terrain changed with every bombardment. The front line was not a line at all. It was a three-dimensional maze of rubble, basements, sewer tunnels, and rooftops, where the enemy might be above you, below you, or in the next room. A German officer wrote home, "The street is no longer measured in meters, but in corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a city. It is not a place on the map. It is a dark, burning thing that eats men." Both sides fed men into the city like coal into a furnace. Every night the Soviets crossed the Volga to bring in reinforcements. A mile of open water. The Germans had every inch of it covered. Every night, as darkness fell, the boats would set out from the East Bank, Barges, ferries, rowboats, anything that floated, loaded with men, ammunition and food. German artillery and mortars would open up the moment they were spotted. Boats were hit constantly, men drowned in freezing water, weighted down by their equipment. Ammunition barges exploded mid-river, lighting up the crossing and drawing even more fire. A Soviet soldier who survived the crossing later described it, "The man next to me was hit in the head and fell into the water. The boat was filling with blood and river water. I could see the fires on the West Bank and I thought, that is where I'm going. That is where they are sending me." On some nights, losses during the crossing itself exceeded 25%, and the survivors stepped off the boats directly into combat. There was no rear area, there was no orientation. You got off the boat, someone pointed you toward the German lines and you started fighting. A newly arrived Soviet soldier's life expectancy in Stalingrad was roughly 24 hours. For officers, it was about 3 days. And yet, they kept coming. You have probably heard of Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building near the center of the city that a small garrison of roughly 25 Soviet soldiers held for 58 days against everything the Germans could throw at it. Sergeant Chuikov Pavlov and his men fortified the building with mines, barbed wire and machine gun positions on every floor. They knocked holes in walls to create interior firing lanes. They connected to their supply lines through communication trenches dug through the rubble. The German maps marked the building as a fortress. It was an apartment block. But here is what's important to understand. Pavlov's house was famous because it survived. There were hundreds of similar stands across the city. Most of them ended when the last defender was killed and the building changed hands, until the Soviets took it back the next night or the night after that. The same ruin might change hands 5, 10, 15 times. There were buildings where the Germans held the upper floors and the Soviets held the basement. And they fought through the ceiling with grenades and bayonets, listening to each other breathe through the floorboards. The battle devolved into something almost medieval. Men fought with bayonets, with sharpened entrenching tools, with their hands. A German veteran later recalled a moment in a factory building. We broke through a wall and found ourselves face to face with Russians. Nobody fired. There was no room. We fought with knives and fists until one side was dead. Snipers became kings of the battlefield. Vasily Zaitsev, yes, the one from the movie, a 2001 film named Enemy at the Gates, directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud, though the movie gets almost everything wrong. Zaitsev operated in the ruins with lethal efficiency and, more importantly, became a propaganda symbol of Soviet resistance. But he was one of many. Both sides deployed dedicated sniper teams, and the psychological toll of the sniper war, the knowledge that stepping in front of a window, any gap in any wall could mean instant death, ground down morale in ways that conventional bombardment could not. Men who could endure shelling broke under the constant invisible threat of the sniper's bullet. Two positions dominated the battle. The grain elevator, a massive concrete silo complex near the southern end of the city, became one of the most fiercely contested single structures of the war. Soviet naval infantry held it for days, fighting floor by floor, room by room, sometimes in complete darkness. Burning grain dust filled the air, choking lungs and blinding eyes. The heat inside the structure was unbearable. Water ran out almost immediately. Wounded men lay where they fell because there was nowhere to move them. When the garrison finally ran out of ammunition and water, the survivors, fewer than 40 from an original force of several hundred, attempted to break out through the German lines at night. Most did not make it. But the grain elevator was a sideshow compared to Mamayev Kurgan. The great burial mound rose 335 feet above the city center. It was the highest point in Stalingrad, and whoever held it could observe and direct fire across the city, the entire city, and down to the river crossings. It was, in the most literal sense, the key to the battle, and both sides knew it. Mamayev kurgan changed hands over a dozen times during the battle. The fighting was so intense that the hill itself was transformed. The earth was churned to a depth of several feet by constant shell fire. Trees were obliterated, the topsoil mixed with metal fragments until it was more shrapnel than dirt. In the winter of 1942, Soviet veterans later said that the snow on Mamayev kurgan would not settle to white. It melted as it fell on the earth, still hot from explosions. Soviet soldiers called the hill the Iron Mound. After the war, when they finally excavated it for a memorial, the soil was saturated with metal fragments. The dead were so numerous and so intermingled that many could never be identified. By mid-October, Chuikov's 62nd Army was barely hanging on. The Germans held about 90% of the city. Soviet positions had been compressed into a few narrow strips along the riverbank, some of them only a few hundred meters deep. In places, you could stand at the German front line and see the Volga. The entire depth of the Soviet defensive zone was within machine gun range. Chuikov's command post was hit repeatedly. He relocated multiple times, once barely escaping as German tanks rolled over his previous position. His staff officers were killed around him. Communications broke down constantly. At times, he had no contact with entire divisions for hours. And still, reinforcements kept coming across the river. On October 14th, the Germans launched their most massive assault yet. 5 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions concentrated against the factory district. The tractor factory fell after savage fighting. The Stalingrad tractor factory was built in 1930, designed by an American firm out of Detroit, the same firm that built Ford's plants, and shipped piece by piece to the Volga as a showpiece of Soviet industrial power. It was supposed to make tractors for collective farms, but by 1942 it was making T-34 tanks, and it kept making them. Even as the Germans closed in on the factory district, even as artillery shells were landing in the assembly halls, the workforce kept building tanks. Men, women, who had been factory workers a week earlier, were now soldiers, armed, organized into militia units, and thrown into the defensive of their own workplace. T-34s were driven off the assembly line straight into combat, sometimes without paint, sometimes without gun sights, crewed by the same workers who had just finished building them. The fighting moved into the factory itself. Soviet soldiers used half-built tanks on the assembly line as strongpoints. Germans cleared the buildings room by room, while in some sections the machinery was still running. The 62nd Army's headquarters was nearly overrun. Chuikov later admitted it was the closest he came to losing the battle. The army was split into isolated pockets along the riverbank, but those pockets held by their fingernails, by their teeth. They held. German commander Friedrich Paulus, the man leading the 6th Army, reported to Hitler that victory was imminent. Just a little more pressure, a few more days. He was wrong, but looking at a map, you could understand why he thought so. What Paulus could not see was already forming just beyond that map. While the world watched the agony inside Stalingrad, the Soviets were assembling something enormous behind the scenes. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the 2 most important Soviet military minds of the war, had been planning a counteroffensive since September. Both men had visited the Stalingrad front personally, crawling through forward positions to see the situation with their own eyes. And what they saw convinced them of something that seems counterintuitive. The very desperation of the city fight was an asset, not a liability. The Germans were obsessed with Stalingrad. Every reserve, every fresh divisions, every available panzer was being committed forward into the rubble. Hitler's fixation on capturing the city was pulling German strength inward, away from the flanks, away from the wider front. And while all eyes were on the ruins, nobody was watching what was gathering in the steppe beyond. The plan was simple. Pulling it off was another matter. They were not going to relieve Stalingrad by attacking into the city, they were going to ignore the city entirely. Instead, they would strike at the weakest point of the German position, the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, held by the Romanian 3rd and 4th armies. The plan was called Operation Uranus. Two massive Soviet pincers would crash through the Romanian lines, sweep west, and link up at the town of Kalach on the Don River, roughly 60 miles behind Stalingrad. If it worked, Pavlov's entire 6th Army, over 250,000 men, would be encircled. The scale of the preparation was immense. The Soviets assembled over 1 million men, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircrafts for the operation. The secrecy was extraordinary. Troop movements were conducted exclusively at night. Radio silence was absolute. All communications went by courier or wire. Dummy positions were constructed to mislead German aerial reconnaissance. Entire tank armies were moved hundreds of miles across the steppe and concealed in ravines and balkas, the shallow gullies that cut across the landscape without being detected. The flaw Hitler had built into Case Blue was now coming home to roost. The German High Command knew the Romanian flanks were vulnerable. They had known for months. Liaison officers attached to Romanian units sent increasingly alarmed dispatches about the quality of defenses and the shortage of anti-tank weapons. But there were no reserves to send. Every available division had been committed to the city or the Caucasus. Paulus and his superiors were so fixated on the street fighting that they failed to see the avalanche forming on the ridgeline above them. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, over 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire along the Don front northwest of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Romanian soldiers who survived described the ground shaking so violently that men could not stand. Then the infantry and tanks went in. The fog was thick that morning, so thick men could barely see the soldier next to them. This worked in the Soviets' favor. It grounded the Luftwaffe and turned the battle into a close-range brawl in which Soviet numerical superiority was decisive. The Romanian Third Army collapsed within hours. It was not entirely the Romanians' fault. They were undermanned, under-equipped, and spread too thin. And they were asked to hold a front far too wide for their capabilities. They had almost no anti-tank guns capable of stopping a T-34. When Soviet armor came rolling through the fog and snow, entire Romanian divisions simply disintegrated. Some units fought bravely and were overwhelmed. Others broke and ran. The result was the same. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincers struck the Romanian 4th Army south of the city. Same result, shattered like the 3rd. Soviet tank columns raced west through the breach, covering ground at a speed that shocked even their own commanders. They drove through snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures, sometimes outrunning their own infantry by miles. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the offensive began, the two pincers linked up at Kalach. The ring was closed. Friedrich Paulus and approximately 265,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped inside a pocket roughly 30 miles long and 20 miles wide, with their backs against the frozen Volga. The Germans had a word for it: Kessel. cauldron. It was the word they had used for the vast encirclements they had imposed on the Soviets in 1941. Now the word belonged to them. The moment the encirclement was complete, Paulus faced a decision that would define the rest of the battle: break out or hold. His instinct and the advice of virtually every other general, every other officer around him, was to break out immediately. But the Soviet ring was still thin. Gather everything, punch southwest, link up with German forces outside the pocket. Yes, you would lose Stalingrad. Yes, you would abandon heavy equipment and many of the wounded, but you would save the army. General von Seydlitz, commanding a corps inside the pocket, was so adamant about breaking out that he began unauthorized withdrawals of his own troops from their positions, trying to create the conditions for withdrawing on his own authority, hoping to force Paulus' hand. Paulus ordered him to stop. He requested permission from Hitler. Hitler said no. Hold your positions. The Luftwaffe will supply you by air. A relief force will break through to you. Stalingrad will not be given up. This was the critical moment, and two men bear particular responsibility for the catastrophe that followed. The first man was Hermann Göring, who assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the pocket by air. This was pure fantasy. The Luftwaffe's chief of staff, General Hans Jeschonnek, told Göring it was impossible. The transport fleet was too small, the distances were too great. Soviet air defenses and anti-aircraft batteries would take a devastating toll. The weather would ground flights for days at a time. Göring waved these objections away. He had promised the Führer, and the Führer expected delivery. The real requirement was closer to 700 tons per day. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies for an entire army. The Luftwaffe never managed more than about 120 tons on its best day. And the average was closer to 80 or 90. On many days it delivered nothing at all. The airlift cost the Luftwaffe over 480 transport aircraft, irreplaceable losses that would cripple German air transport capacity for the rest of the war. Göring's promise was either a delusion or a lie, and he condemned them all. The second man bearing responsibility was Hitler himself, who refused to face reality. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. To retreat from it was, in Hitler's mind, a propaganda defeat he could not accept. The city had become a symbol, and Hitler understood symbols. He understood that the world was watching, that Stalin was watching, that retreating from a city called Stalingrad would announce German weakness to every occupied nation and every wavering ally. He was right about the symbolism. He was catastrophically wrong about the solution. And so the Sixth Army stayed. In December, the Germans launched their relief attempt, Operation Winterstorm, Wintergewitter, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the best operational mind in the German army. Manstein had been given command of the newly created army group, Dawn, a formation scraped together from whatever was available. Battered Romanian remnants, a few German divisions pulled from quieter sectors, and crucially, the 6th Panzer Division, which had been refitting in France and was rushed east by rail. It was a scratch force being asked to break through a Soviet ring that was strengthening by the day. Manstein attacked from the southwest on December 12th. The plan was to drive northeast along the rail line from Kotelnikovo toward the pocket. At first, he moved well. The 6th Panzer Division was a first-class formation, full of veterans, and its tanks pushed through the initial Soviet defenses with professional efficiency. Within a week, the relief force had advanced over 30 miles and reached the Mishkova River. On clear nights, men in the leading panthers claimed they could see the flashes of gunfire outside the pocket. They were that close, about 30 miles away, and then it stalled. The Soviets had anticipated the relief attempt. Chuikov committed the Second Guards Army, a powerful reserve formation, to block Manstein at the Mishkova. The fighting was intense. The 6th Panzer Division fought hard, but it could not break through. At the same time, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive further up the Don that smashed the Italian 8th Army and threatened to cut off Manstein's entire relief force. Suddenly, Manstein was not just trying to rescue 6th Army, he was trying to prevent his own encirclement. He was forced to divert the 6th Panzer Division away from the rescue attempt to plug the gap left by the Italian collapse. Before he did, he sent a message to Paulus. The message, in essence, was this: I cannot reach you. You must break out now toward my force, while there is still a corridor, codename Donnerschlag, thunderclap. Paulus said he could not break out without Hitler's authorization. Manstein told him to request it and do it immediately. Paulus radioed Hitler. Hitler refused. Paulus obeyed. There is a debate among historians about whether Paulus could have broken out even if he had tried. His fuel reserves were critically low. His men were already weakening from hunger. The breakout would have required abandoning the wounded, perhaps tens of thousands of them. But most military historians agree the attempt should have been made. A fighting retreat with heavy losses was preferable to the certainty of annihilation. By Christmas, Winter Storm was dead. The last realistic chance to save 6th Army had passed, starving in the snow. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. The airlift was a trickle. Rations were cut and cut again. By late December, the daily bread ration was down to 50 grams per man, 2 thin slices. Then it dropped further. Soldiers slaughtered and ate horses. Then the horses were gone. They ate the dogs. When the dogs were gone, they ate wherever they could find, even rats. When there was nothing left to eat, they boiled the leather from their equipment belts and boots to make a kind of broth. It did not nourish, it just filled the stomach for an hour or so. A German soldier wrote in his diary, "We sit in our holes and wait." For what? For food that does not come, for relief that does not come, for an end that does come slowly. Frostbite was epidemic. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 Celsius. Men without adequate winter clothing, and most of them lacked adequate winter clothing, lost fingers, toes, ears, noses. The medical system collapsed. Tens of thousands of wounded lay in makeshift shelters, bombed out basements, railway tunnels, the remains of buildings with no medicine, no anesthesia, no heat, and no hope. Surgeons performed amputations without painkillers. Gangrene set in everywhere. The stench of the field hospitals was indescribable. Typhus swept through the pocket, so did dysentery and lice. Men who were not killed by the enemy were being killed by their own bodies. Some froze to death in their sleep. Others simply walked out in the snow and did not come back. Nobody stopped them. And yet, on the perimeter, the fight continued. Soviet forces steadily compressed the pocket, launching attack after attack, grinding the defenders down. The Germans fought back with desperation, and it was a desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, which made them dangerous but could not change the logic of the battlefield, the mathematics. Every day the pocket shrank. Every day more men died. Every day fewer supplies arrived. What is perhaps the hardest to comprehend is that there were still men inside the pocket who believed they could be rescued. Until the very end, some soldiers clung to hope that the Führer would not abandon them, that another relief force would come, that some miracle would happen. The human capacity for hope, even irrational hope, even hope in the face of absolute evidence to the contrary, is one of the most stubborn forces on earth. Inside the castle, the cauldron, it kept some men alive, and a few days longer, but it did not save them. In January, the Luftwaffe organized a final mail flight out of the pocket. Soldiers were told they could write one last letter home. Many of the letters were later collected and published. They're among the most haunting documents of the war. Some were defiant, some were resigned, many were simply bewildered. Men who could not understand how they had gone from conquering Europe to dying in a frozen cellar for a city they had never heard of 2 years earlier. One soldier wrote, "You will never see me again, that is certain. I am not afraid. I have simply been used up like ammunition." Another, "Tell mother I did my duty. That is all I can say. I do not know any more what duty means, but I did it." Not all the letters were delivered. Many were intercepted by the Nazi censorship apparatus, which was horrified by the way these soldiers felt defeated and the anger they contained. The regime spent months telling the German public that the Sixth Army was holding firm, fighting heroically. These letters told a different story. Most were destroyed. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets sent a formal offer to surrender through the lines, promising humane treatment for prisoners of war. It listed the conditions: lay down your weapons, you will receive food, medical treatment, and eventually repatriation. Paulus forwarded to Hitler. The answer came back immediately: surrender is forbidden. Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and the last round. On January 10th, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to destroy the pocket. 7 Soviet armies attacked from every direction with overwhelming force. The western half of the pocket collapsed in days. The airfields, Pitomnik, then Gumrak, fell one by one, cutting off the last air supply. Thousands of wounded who had been gathered at the airfields for evacuation were left behind. They would die where they lay. The German forces were split in two, then in two fragments, then in two isolated pockets of resistance scattered across the rubble. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message was unmistakable. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an invitation to suicide. Paulus understood the implication. He chose not to accept it. On January 31st, 1943, in the basement of the Univermag department store on Red Square, and yes, apparently Stalingrad had its own Red Square, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to a young Soviet lieutenant named Fyodor Ilchenko. It was the first time a German field marshal had been captured alive. When Hitler received the news, he flew into a rage. He should have shot himself, as generals used to do when they saw that the cause was lost. The man should have shot himself, just as the old commanders who threw themselves on the swords when they saw that the cause was lost. It was a little bit repetitive. Fighting continued in the northern pocket under General Karl Strecker for 2 more days. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German units laid down their arms. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The numbers at Stalingrad resist comprehension. They also resist precision. Soviet and German records are incomplete, politically distorted or contradictory, and historians still argue about exact figures, but the scale is beyond dispute. The Soviets suffered an estimated 1.1 million total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, in the Stalingrad area between July 1942 and February 1943. Of those, roughly 480,000 were killed or missing. Some historians put the total higher. Soviet-era sources had every reason to undercount, and the chaos of the fighting made accurate record-keeping impossible. The Germans and their allies lost approximately 800,000 total casualties across the broader campaign. And that allies matters, because Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Croatian units absorbed enormous losses that are sometimes overlooked. Of the roughly 265,000 Axis soldiers trapped inside the pocket, approximately 91,000 surrendered. Of those 91,000, roughly 5,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet captivity, of starvation, disease, exhaustion, and exposure. Many died within weeks of their surrender, already too far gone to be saved. The last survivors were not repatriated until 1955, a full decade after the war ended. The difference was not in the count, it was in what each army could replace. The Soviets could fill the gaps, the Germans could not. The civilian population of Stalingrad, which had been roughly 400,000 before the battle, was virtually annihilated. Tens of thousands were killed in the bombing and the fighting. Those who survived endured months of combat in their own homes, in their own streets. The city itself was erased. Not a single building was left undamaged. In Germany, the news of Stalingrad hit like a physical blow. 3 days of national mourning were declared. Cinemas and theaters were closed. For the first time, the German public confronted the possibility, still unspoken, still unthinkable in official channels, that the war might be lost. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, tried to spin the disaster into a narrative of heroic sacrifice. On February 18, 1943, he delivered his infamous Sportpalast speech, screaming at a hand-picked audience, "Do you want total war?" The crowd roared, "Yes!" It was a performance of mass hysteria, designed to convert catastrophe into fanaticism. It worked. It worked partially. Germany fought on for more than 2 years, but something had cracked. The letters that came back from Stalingrad, the empty places at family tables, the official notifications that listed entire units as missing, these things could not be unsaid. Stalingrad was the turning point of the Second World War, not just in a military sense, though it was certainly that. The destruction of the Sixth Army was a loss from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. The cream of the German officers' corps, irreplaceable experienced NCOs and soldiers, and vast quantities of equipment were gone. You cannot replace 20 years of institutional knowledge with fresh conscripts. But Stalingrad was a psychological turning point that transcended the merely military. Before Stalingrad, there was a widespread belief in Germany, among the Allies, and even in the Soviet Union itself, that the Wehrmacht was essentially unbeatable. That it might be slowed, might be bloodied, but could not be fundamentally defeated in a major engagement. Stalingrad obliterated that myth. 250,000 men surrendered. A field marshal surrendered. The aura of invincibility was gone, and once it was gone, it could never be restored. For the Soviet people, Stalingrad was the moment the war shifted from existential survival to something that looked, for the first time, like it might end in victory. It did not end the suffering. 3 more years of brutal fighting lay ahead, but it changed the character of the suffering. After Stalingrad, the Red Army was attacking. After Stalingrad, the Germans were retreating. And in the wider world, Stalingrad announced to everyone paying attention, and everyone was paying attention, that Nazi Germany was going to lose this war. The question was no longer whether, but when. And here we go to our last section, the road not taken, about hypotheticals, if things could have gone another way. What if Paulus had broken out in November? This is the big one. When the encirclement closed on November 23rd, there was a narrow window, perhaps a week, maybe two, during which Sixth Army could have attempted a breakout to the southwest. Many of Paulus's corps commanders urged exactly this. Von Seydlitz was practically screaming for it. The case for it is strong. The Soviet encirclement ring was initially thin and disorganized. Soviet forces were stretched across a vast perimeter and had not yet consolidated their positions. A concentrated armored thrust might have punched through. The army would have lost most of its heavy equipment and many of the wounded. But the bulk of the combat troops, perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 men, might have escaped. The counter-argument is logistical. Sixth Army's fuel reserves were desperately low. Paulus estimated his panzers had enough fuel for about 20 miles of movements. The nearest friendly lines were 40 to 60 miles away. Could they have made it? Maybe. Maybe not. It would have been a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice in freezing conditions, with exhausted men and uncertain fuel supplies. But it was a gamble with better odds than the certainty of destruction that came from staying. A breakout would have saved the army but surrendered the city. It would have been a significant retreat, perhaps the most politically embarrassing retreat of the war for Hitler. But it would have preserved 250,000 trained soldiers for future operations. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 would have looked very different with those veterans still in the order of battle. What if Hitler had not split Army Group South? This is the deeper counterfactual, the one that goes back to before the city was even threatened. Had Army Group South remained unified and focused on a single objective, either Stalingrad or the Caucasus, not both, the entire campaign might have unfolded differently. A concentrated drive on Stalingrad with the full weight of Army Group South would have reached the city earlier, with more force and with stronger flanks. The Romanian and Italian armies would not have been stretched to the breaking point, guarding an impossibly long front. German divisions would have held the flanks instead of Allied ones. The conditions that made Uranus possible: thin, vulnerable Allied flanks stretching for hundreds of miles, might never have existed. In alternative, a focused drive into the Caucasus without the destruction of Stalingrad might have actually reached the oil fields, the strategic objective that justified the entire campaign in the first place. Army Group A got tantalizingly close to Maikop, but never had the strength to push through to Baku. By trying to do both, Hitler achieved neither. And what if Paulus had disobeyed orders? This is the question that haunts the battle. At multiple critical junctures, the breakout decision in November, the Donnerschlag moment during winter storm, the rejection of surrender terms in January, Paulus had the authority on the ground to act independently. His communications with higher command were imminent. He could have presented Hitler with a fait accompli. Other German commanders did exactly this during the war. Manstein routinely interpreted orders with creative latitude. Model pushed back constantly. Even on the Eastern Front, commanders sometimes retreated without authorization and survived the political consequences because they saved their armies. Paulus was not that kind of general. He was a staff officer by training and temperament, meticulous, obedient, uncomfortable with ambiguity. Stalingrad was his first major combat command. He was the wrong man, in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. There is one more thing worth saying. Paulus had a wife and children inside Germany. The Nazi regime practiced Sippenhaft, kin liability. Maybe it wasn't something that was openly declared, but disobedience at this level meant his family would answer for it, and after the surrender, his family was in fact arrested. None of this excuses what he did or did not do at Stalingrad, but it makes him less merely weak and more genuinely tragic. He was not just a man choosing between his army and his career, he was a man choosing between his army and his family. That he chose neither, that he obeyed Hitler and lost both, this is the final smallest cruelty of Stalingrad. In closing, the battle for the city lasted 163 days. The full campaign from the first German approach in August to the last surrender in February stretched over 200 days. When it was over, the city was gone, the army was gone, and the war, the whole shape of the war, was different. There is a memorial on Mamayev Kurgan today. It took 18 years to build. At its center stands a colossal statue of a woman raising a sword toward the sky. The motherland calls. She stands 279 feet tall, one of the largest statues on Earth, visible from miles away across the steppe. Beneath her lie the remains of 34,505 Soviet soldiers reinterred in a mass grave during the memorial's construction. They are not alone. The ground around them, for miles in every direction, is saturated with the dead on both sides. Men who fought and froze and starved for a strip of riverbank in a city named after a dictator who never set foot there. The city was renamed Volgograd in 1961 after the de-Stalinization, but the battle is still called Stalingrad. It always will be, because the name is no longer about the man, it is about what happened there. Stalingrad was not a battle, it was a wound, and the world still carries the scars. Well, this is it for today's episode, and next time we will just go into our last battle. It will still be in World War II, and it will be a battle that will be shaping the fate of the entire world. We will go to Normandy. I will see you on the battlefield, and thank you very much for following up. Bye.